Now, our first speaker is Dr. William Polonsky. He's president and co-founder of the Behavioral Diabetes Institute, the world's first organization wholly dedicated to studying and addressing the unmet psychological needs of people with diabetes. He's an associate clinical professor in medicine at the University of California, San Diego. He has highly cited research scientists with more than 100 peer-reviewed publications in the field of behavioral diabetes. Dr. Polonsky is chairman of the National Certification Board of Diabetes Educators and an award-winning researcher in the field of behavioral diabetes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Polonsky.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Let me bring up my slides. I appreciate it. And of course, a very happy 130th birthday to Fred Banting. So glad to be here. I was asked by Brian to talk about this subject. I spent the past 33 years focusing on the emotional side of diabetes, both as a clinician and as a researcher. I've had the pleasure and honor to meet and work with and learn from many thousands of folks with diabetes. And we're going to take one aspect of the emotional side of diabetes today and talk about the interpersonal aspect. And while I imagine Dr. Hirsch, who's going to be speaking later, and our other panelists will actually talk about real data, I really want to talk about concept with a tiny bit of data. So before we get directly into the interpersonal side, I want to speak a little more broadly. One of the things we understand is that we know for people who don't have diabetes, it could be family members or friends or coworkers, oftentimes they don't know much about diabetes. And they tend to think of diabetes like, it's no big deal. You can be just like this happy guy. All you have to do is, just take your insulin, take your medications, eat perfectly, just do what you're supposed to do, done, simple. But what we know from the perspective of people who are living every day with diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, also for type 2 diabetes, the day-to-day experience sometimes isn't as easy. And often the experience is more reflected in what this guy is going through. It is an ongoing, challenging balancing act. And to put it more clearly, really we can appreciate that living every day with diabetes, from the perspective of people who have it, it can be tough. It can be really challenging. It is a job, and it's a time-consuming and frustrating job. And think about what it's like. Those of you who may remember when you were diagnosed, the day you're diagnosed, the universe just said to you, congratulations, welcome to the world of diabetes. Here's this job for you to do. Yeah, you didn't volunteer for it. There's no pay. There's no vacations. You get to do it for the rest of your life, and just, stay vigilant. You need to give this, if you're going to want to stay healthy, you need to give this disease a lot of attention. And as we can appreciate, though, it really is a balancing act, right? You don't want to have blood sugars that are too low or too high. It requires your effort and vigilance. Now, I don't want to bemoan the fact too much, because in fact, we know there's lots of people who pull this off. They have taken on the job of diabetes, and even though it can be a challenge, they've been successful over the course of time. But we want to appreciate what they're doing is they have this job, this really difficult job. And we're asking people with diabetes to take on this job on top of all of their other life responsibilities, all the other pressures and stresses that can drive us all nuts. So let's just appreciate that this can be tough. And of course, the end result of dealing with daily life, like we're all trying to do, dealing with a pandemic, like we're all trying to do, and the job of diabetes, the end result for, well, so many of the many thousands of people I've had a chance to meet is just, they're wiped out. It's exhausting. You can get overwhelmed or really burned out about diabetes. So we've taken time to think about this concept. And as we've studied over the decades, we like to refer to it as what we call diabetes distress. And diabetes distress in our research is really what so many of you understand. It's the felt burden of living with this tough and really demanding disease. And some of the highlights of it is we know sometimes people feel they're despairing. They feel hopeless and helpless, like they feel like terrible things are going to happen to them, terrible complications. and there's no way to avoid it. They get discouraged when you feel like your very best efforts, don't seem to work. And they can get exhausted, and again, just for all the reasons that I described. Now, when we've actually done research on this, we really understand how common this is, especially elevated levels of diabetes distress. Odds are good, everybody feels overwhelmed and upset and stressed out and angry and fed up with diabetes from time to time. But living chronically with high levels of diabetes distress, those are the people we worry about the most. And if you've ever gone through anything like that, or periods like that, or going through it now, let me tell you how common that is, because our best evidence suggests it's this common, that about more than 40% of people with type 1, and a similar number, about 36% of people with type 2, meet our formal criteria for really living with high levels of diabetes distress. Now, if you haven't heard about that, or you want to know more about diabetes distress, or know how you're doing, do you fit that criteria of elevated distress, and what are the factors that influence you? There's a website, diabetesdistress.org. This is completely free. It's completely anonymous, and it allows you on this website to complete one of our diabetes distress scales. It doesn't save any of these data, so it's totally private, but it automatically scores your data and then tells you what your score is, what it means, and gives you a better sense of where you are and what you do with that. So I just want you to know about that. Now, having said that, we've talked about these different features of diabetes distress: hopelessness and discouragement and exhaustion. But there's one more important one, and it's what we want to talk about for the rest of our time here, which is isolation. It's really easy to feel burned out and distressed about diabetes if you feel alone with diabetes. And let me give you an example of that. One of the things that often we do in our small group programs is that we'll ask people, usually adults with diabetes, to draw us pictures, like what's living with diabetes like for you? And years ago, in one of our programs, one of the participants drew this picture. And this was a nice woman with type 1 diabetes. She was in her mid-30s. And one thing you'll notice about her immediately is she will never become a famous artist, but she is telling us something very important in this picture that she explained to me. She said, look, that's me over there on the left. You notice I have a grimace. That's my husband and my 2 kids. They're smiling and all holding hands. And what lies between us is what she calls this diabetic wall. She goes, look, I know my family loves me, but they don't get it. And they don't really understand the amount of effort and vigilance and worries and concerns I have, even though they mean well. And it's this separation, this isolation that was really dragging her down, really burning her out. So we know this is often a big challenge for folks living with diabetes every day. And here in the year 2021, we have this extra problem, which is this pandemic. So many of us are feeling isolated anyway. So we understand a lot of that and about what's going on. Now, in some of the studies that we've done to date, we also understand what people are struggling with in terms of that isolation. So for example, in one study, when we asked people with diabetes, tell us what your aggravations are with your friends and family. And by the way, we often call people, friends and family members of people with diabetes, we often call them people with type 3 diabetes, which is a term I know Brian loves. The term type 3 diabetes was, I believe, coined by my good friend, Dr. Steve Edelman, and also Dr. Hirsch's friend as well. And it really, again, this idea that our loved ones, they're struggling to some degree with diabetes as well. But when people with diabetes talk about their friends and family, what we found is you can see almost half of them said, I feel like my friends and family aren't particularly supportive enough of my efforts to try to manage this disease. They don't really appreciate how difficult diabetes can be for me day to day. And oftentimes, excuse me, I find that my friends and family just act like diabetes policemen. And I bet you've heard of this term, diabetes police. It's been around for a while. I believe my colleagues and I were the ones who coined this back in the late 80s. And the diabetes police should be pretty familiar to you if you've been living with diabetes for more than, 2 minutes. Diabetes police are your friends, your family, your coworkers, or a subset of them who have decided in some strange way that God has deputized them to help you manage your diabetes, whether you like it or not. And that's the issue. And they can often be recognized by some of the things that they may say from you. Now, they're almost always coming from a place of caring, of love. But sometimes the things that they say are kind of annoying, like, honey, really, should you be eating that? Or, sweetheart, you seem a little upset right now. Maybe you should go check your blood sugars. Or, I can't help but notice, darling, that your blood sugars are, high again. What do you think you did wrong this time? Now, again, well-intentioned, but if you feel like you're getting bugged and nagged, there's an understandable sense of wanting to respond by doing the opposite of what's being suggested to you, right? This is how people assert their independence. It's a tenet of psychology. So, oh, you don't think I should be eating this? Watch this. So inadvertently, you become a diabetes criminal. So let's think about that and how we can begin to address some of these issues. Again, what's really the problem here? Now, one thing to mention about why so many friends and family members, maybe some of you are listening right now, are often become diabetes policemen is because they're so, not just coming from a place of love, but they're so concerned and they're so worried. We actually have fairly good research that family members, especially parents and spouses, are often more concerned about diabetes, more distressed about diabetes than their partner or their child. And this is especially true when we talk about hypoglycemia. We know, for example, that spouses and partners of people with type 1 diabetes in particular often have insomnia because they're so concerned about what's going to happen during their partner during the night. And for those of you with CGMs, you also may notice this very peculiar finding that we see everywhere, which is that if your CGM alarm goes off in the middle of the night, it's usually heard by your partner and spouse and not by you, the person with diabetes, which is pretty peculiar. So one problem is we know that they're more worried and more concerned often than the person with diabetes. We know that they typically do care, your friends and families, but they may not know the best way to be supportive. And even though they don't know, they make the mistake of trying to be mind readers and just saying, well, I think the most helpful thing I can do is this. But inadvertently, what happens is their best efforts may just be irritating or counterproductive, as we've talked about. So this really underscores and leads us to this opportunity of something that we've seen and evaluated over the course of these decades. There's a huge opportunity here, and it really comes down to, one of the tenets that we've seen in behavioral science over the course of 20 or 30 years, which is that when you got people in your life who really care about you and love you and do it in the right way, this is extraordinarily helpful in allowing any of us to make and maintain positive behavior changes. And that's true whether you have diabetes or not. When you got people in your life who are supporting you in the right way, it really helps us all to be successful and really tends to alleviate diabetes distress. So how do we make this happen? How do we help this to occur so that people can be successful? How do we help people to help their family members to help them in the right way? And again, it gets to this key that if we're going to alleviate diabetes distress, the most important thing that we've learned, I feel like I've been saying this for decades, is if at all possible, we don't want people to have to do diabetes alone. That if you can reach out to make new friends and families, people who get it, maybe people who have diabetes as well, or begin to change how your family members and your friends and coworkers are already dealing with diabetes in your life, that can make an enormous difference. So one thing, of course, is to be able to reach out to others, right, that we know, especially others who have diabetes. I mean, one of the biggest complaints we hear is, I wish I knew other people who kind of just get it. And of course, as you may know, there's lots of resources out there for people with diabetes that can allow you to meet and connect with other people. And this is just a short list of some of those here, whether it's beyond type 1, beyond type 2, diabetes sisters, and more, that can really allow connection, at least online. Because doing it in person, doing it locally is even better. But when we think about what about the family members and the friends and the coworkers that you have right now, what do we do about those, again, type 3 diabetes individuals who are not supporting you in the way you need, who are bugging you or nagging you in a way that's driving you nuts? So here's what we've learned over the time that can make a difference. And there's really 5 points. Number 1 is, remember, if you have someone who's really nagging you, remember, odds are pretty good that they do mean well. They want to help. But also remember, because they love you and they care about you, they're probably going to never stop bugging you, which I know sounds kind of horrible, but again, they're coming from a place of love. And that tells us the solution is to not just say, leave me alone, stop hassling me, but to think about how we can change what's going on. And to do that, I go on to step 3, which is it's important to pick a quiet moment, a dispassionate moment for having a gentle confrontation with that friend or family member, to have a conversation about diabetes, how they think about diabetes, and how you're going to move forward in terms of your relationship with them and diabetes. And one of the most useful things you can do is, before you do anything else, I know this can be painful, but you might want to thank them. Now, I know, thank them for being annoying, but it's a great place to start. You want to thank them for, even though they're driving you crazy, they're trying to help. But then very, very quickly, you want to move on to step 5. You want to explain very specifically, how you on your own are actually already doing your best job to take good care of your diabetes. And specifically, walk them through some of the ways about things that you kind of want them to stop doing, right? And things you might want them to start doing. And think about what some of those things are. Maybe you, again, want them to stop commenting if they think you're low and that you should go check your blood sugar, or commenting on what you eat, things like that. But because they're never going to stop because they care about you, it's critically important that you give them some things that they can do, things they can start doing. Could you make sure there's always diet soda in the refrigerator, for example? One area where we really see this happening is when you look at the use of the Dexcom and how people are using the share follow function. And if you're not familiar with that, again, the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system has this share follows app so that you can have friends and family see your data live, your glucose data live. And I'll tell you a couple of funny things about that. First of all, if you Google Dexcom Share and look at images, you'll notice you pretty much only see images of little kids and their parents. You almost never see images of adults, which is fascinating. And I think part of the reason is, even though we've studied this and we see lots of people who do use Dexcom Share, adults, if you just walk around the world and ask adults with type 1 diabetes, perhaps yourself as well, who do you share your data with? Who do you let see your real-time continuous glucose data with? And I'm really impressed how many people say, absolutely no one sees my data. And oftentimes because there's so much critiquing and blaming in the past, and who needs to be sitting over my shoulder and looking at my data and perhaps wanting to give me ideas that I don't really want. So it's easier just to say, no, thank you. But we do know, and we have studied and published data on this, where we see in particular where couples are successful, that there's a way of bringing people together, moving beyond the diabetes police, that allows people to benefit from this sharing of continuous glucose data and feeling better over the time and reducing diabetes distress. And one of the most important keys is when the individual with diabetes and their partner sits down and they have a very, very clear plan set out loud about exactly what we're going to do with this data. So, for example, I don't need you to ever ask me why when you see my glucose data. I don't even need you to comment at all unless you think I'm low and dangerously low. And then I want to have some clear rules about exactly how I'd like you to respond if you think I'm getting low. Like, don't ask me why, maybe just put a glass of juice in front of me, perhaps text me in a certain manner. But whatever it is, it's going to be unique for you and your partner. But having that conversation is what seems to be most key. So all of these can be effective, but in fact, sometimes it's not quite enough, because sometimes those people in your life, your diabetes policemen, they might need a little more of a hint about what to do. And for them, many years ago, my colleagues at the Behavioral Diabetes Institute developed what we call our diabetes etiquette cards. And these are cards for people who do not have diabetes. So if you feel kind of stuck with the people in your life who just don't seem to get it, conversation doesn't seem to be working, we develop these little accordion cards that you can then politely hand to your friend, family member, spouse, coworker, and say, oh, I understand you probably just don't know the rules about how to behave about diabetes. And these little cards are supposed to be at least mildly funny, but they're designed to open up a conversation. That's all they are, a conversation starter. Just to give you an example, here's etiquette rule number 1. Don't offer unsolicited advice about my eating or any other aspect of diabetes. You may mean well, but giving advice about someone's personal habits, especially when it is not requested, isn't very nice. Besides, many of the popularly held beliefs about diabetes, like you should just stop eating sugar, are out of date or just plain wrong. That's as politely as we could do this. So these are all freely available. I'll give you the website, by the way, in just a moment. We also made a version, by the way, for etiquette for teenagers to give to their parents. Not that parents should act this way, but we want parents to know what their teenagers want. And just to give you an example of that accordion card, just the first one, is, Mom and Dad, stop trying to scare me with diabetes statistics. You told me a million times that many years of high blood sugars can hurt me. I understand you are scared and want the best for me, but bugging me about complications just makes me want to tune you out. If I need motivation, it has to be something important to me right now, not way down the road. Again, these are just designed not to be hard and fast rules, but they're to open a conversation with the people in your life who care about you. So in sum, we recognize that diabetes can be tough. It can be tough to live with every day for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons is that it can be isolating, that even if you have people in your life who love you and care about you in so many ways, they may not really get what this is like and what you're going through and the nuances of the behavioral and the emotional side of this disease. And it doesn't have to be so. We really, really want to encourage you to be as clever and creative as you can to, in any way possible, don't go on and do diabetes alone. When you got people in your life who are rooting for you and caring about you, it can make all the difference in the world. Now, I know you have some important speakers, and I'm going to have to slide out of here pretty soon to make way for some of them. But I just wanted to highlight for you that if you ever do want to come visit us here in San Diego at the Behavioral Diabetes Institute, please do so. And also, this is how you find us online. This is also how you would find those diabetes etiquette cards, which are, again, free for you to download as a PDF and to use. We can't really download the accordion cards. That's too complicated, but just as a sheet, they're available for anybody, anywhere in the world. So it's at behavioraldiabetes.org. So I hope this has been helpful. I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and to our discussion later. Thanks for listening. I'll turn this back over to Brian. Thanks. Brian, I think you are. There you are.
Oops. Can you hear me? Thank you, Dr. Polonsky. I really appreciate that. I want to say something about Dr. Polonsky. A couple years ago, I did a presentation at a Lions convention. It was a presentation on type 3 diabetes. And it was on the program, and everybody was saying, what is type 3 diabetes? I had doctors coming up to me and say, what is type 3 diabetes? And one doctor said, I never heard of it. Is it a new thing? I said, well, you're going to have to listen to the presentation. So he did touch on type 3 diabetes, which is pretty cool. Also, diabetic etiquette, Dr. Polonsky, I wrote a blog about that about 2 years ago, and I have your what you call 10 commandments of diabetic etiquette. So and I have a list. I have a link to Dr. Polonsky's website too there. So you have a lot of resources to get to his website. Thank you, Dr. Polonsky. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Bye-bye.